So let's start. Let's kick this off. Aaron, I'm gonna let you take the lead on this one. How has Trump defined himself in the eyes of the electorate? How has Biden defined himself in the eyes of the electorate?
Yeah, it's really interesting. So whether a presidential election or marketing your own product, there's an element of personal branding that always goes into this, and it's so crucial because that's where you make that emotional connection and you get to brand yourself and market yourself in a certain way. And both of these candidates have chosen very specific ways that they're choosing to market and to brand themselves. And they're ways that are probably pretty obvious. You know, what you think about Trump, his we'll say, for lack of a better word, strengths and weaknesses, and same thing with Biden, his own strengths and weaknesses, and they're sort of playing to their own strengths and weaknesses, maximizing their strengths, minimizing their weaknesses. So Trump, like I said, we're going to keep our personal opinions out of this, but it's definitely, I think, undeniable to say that Trump has always marketed himself as strong and decisive. He is the anti-politician. He's uncorruptible by his own words, but really personal branding with Trump is just really strength, just like determined, just like this epitome of strength. I keep using the word strength over and over again, but I think that that's just at the core of his personal branding. But the interesting part is to see sort of Biden, who in some ways is not an antithesis to that, but really markets himself in a sort of different way. Not that Biden wouldn't be considered strong necessarily, but Biden's like an empathetic sort of a perspective, sympathetic. You see his advertisements where he gets emotional or he'll get teary-eyed, and you could just never in a bajillion years imagine Trump having like a commercial where he's like retrospectively thinking about something that happened in his life before, and like a single tear rolls down his face. Like, the man's incapable probably of that. So we really have an enormous disparity in their personal branding, and it sort of it made the campaign very interesting because you have these two candidates who are sort of projecting different things. Trump, strong and decisive, and Biden, as you put in the notes here, Rafie, which I like, as sort of the kind grandfather. So yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
I think Trump also, he's played the personal branding game for so long.
He's a master of it in so many
Yeah,
ways.
and like he's traded on that for the longest time, and fair play to him for being able to find some measure of success and notoriety that way. I mean, success to the point that he became president of the United States, right?
Yeah, pretty. It worked.
Yeah, and and he says that he's a successful businessman, and and it must be the case because he's got all of these properties, his name's everywhere, that kind of thing, right? And that's how he's managed to reach a certain reach the American people in the sense that, like, this is what success outwardly looks like, and he defines it that way, and he is a success by his very own definition. And he's been so good at contextualizing his achievements on his own terms, right? That very few people can take on those terms and come out on top if they try to have a disagreement with how he positions himself. That to me is masterful. It shows a very, very keen awareness of the importance of very strong and very clear messaging.
Yeah, dude, 100%. That was really well said. And yeah, say what you want about Trump, but he definitely understands branding, and the way that he has branded himself over the years, from sort of like a playboy billionaire to the swamp cleaner president. But still, there's been that sense of like unapologeticness to him, of like sort of excess of sort of, I'm right and there's no other options out there, and for many people that's sort of a representation of strength in a lot of ways, and it's been his branding and he's stuck to it. So it's been interesting to see his campaign, but also on the antithesis with Biden, the kind grandfather.
Yeah, and that's the thing about Biden, though. He's I suppose, like, he has his brand is sort of like a nurturing masculinity type, right? Where it's sort of, he's not getting caught up in in whether or not he's a nurturing figure. He says, and he shows that he's a nurturing figure, right? And he's meant to be, this center of he positions himself as an avatar of healing, as the conscience of the country, so to speak. Like that's what he has positioned himself as, and I guess we'll see whether it works or not, depending on the results, right?
Time will tell. And it should be worth noting, actually, as of recording this, the election results are still up in the air. So we actually do not know who has won yet. So it kind of adds an interesting element to our discussion because we don't know who won. So it's actually even more interesting to kind of, analyze their different marketing strategies.
Yeah. And in Biden's case, there was, there in the earlier parts of his campaign, you could say that there was a bit of confusion as to who is Joe Biden and what does he stand for, right? Because the early candidates had very strong branding as well. When you talked about Elizabeth Warren and her catchphrase, "I have a plan for that." You talked about Bernie Sanders and saying that, Bernie Sanders was a very out and proud socialist Democrat, right? And he labeled himself that, and he was very clear about his branding and messaging. And Joe was sort of, not really sure about how he positioned himself. He's a centrist, he's a moderate, yes, but, does he have the force of personality to become a strong candidate? And ultimately, I feel like he has defined his personal branding as, like you said, basically the antithesis of Donald Trump. And, that's that seems to be strong enough to make it a very competitive contest across the board. So
yeah, dude, definitely. And it's interesting to see as marketers too, just like, Trump's sort of style versus Biden's style. Like, sometimes a Trump sort of message where you are sort of going strong, going very, very, very to your core and trying to speak to them and to energize them. Sometimes that can be very effective, for a product or a campaign. Sometimes though, a more broad message, just trying to go straight down the middle, appeal to as many people as possible can also be effective. So there's things to learn on both sides of the campaign. And we should probably use that then to segment to our next about campaign strategies.
Yeah, that's a great segue actually, because we're going to talk about like, I think one last word on the personal branding, right? Because, I think we do encounter brands that talk about how they need to shout or they need to constantly beat, their target markets over the head with who they are and what they are, right? And sometimes it works. Sometimes people just need to be constantly reminded of what a brand's strength is. And that's sort of like what Trump does. Consistent messaging all the time, and it's always very loud. You cannot ignore Donald Trump. You will always hear what his message is. Versus Joe, who's a bit more, a bit more laid back, a bit more, a bit more, not to say subtle, because you can't be subtle in a presidential election, but sort of like, a bit more reserved or a bit quieter in that sense. So yeah.
Yeah, he was definitely trying to be lower key. I think a lot of the strategy for the Biden campaign was to let Trump bury himself. I'm sure, they were just like, let him talk. That's what they were kind of hoping would happen. And they just kind of stay in the background a little bit. And I think they took a less is more sort of approach, at least when it came to like public speaking and like doing interviews and stuff like that, as opposed to Trump, who was just like in your face, I am here. This is my brand. So really two very different strategies there.